Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, I thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar presentation. As you mentioned, Maria, I've had over 20 years experience as an asylum officer at the Miami Asylum Office. And so I interviewed and made decisions on maybe well over 10,000 cases during my career as an asylum officer. So I'm quite experienced, obviously, in the interview process, as well as the whole asylum system here in the United States. So I want to thank you very much for inviting me to the webinar and to speak to asylum seekers and those others who may be interested in asylum, in the asylum process here. The REEF Asylum Support Group is an excellent group, and I thank you for all that you do. Let me just briefly mention a few points, and the main focus today is I'll give you some background, some maybe inside information, what it looks like to be an asylum officer, to interview applicants like yourselves, and to make decisions. Before I begin, I just want to thank you all, and please, if you do have any questions, that's the main focus of today. Is I'll be happy to answer any questions that that you may have. Let me just a few brief points. The expectations of an asylum officer. Asylum officers are highly trained individuals. A lot of them do have law degrees. I would say maybe half or maybe more than half have law degrees, and other asylum officers have had a lot of experience in the international arena, human rights, so forth. So they're very highly trained. What we do is we listen very closely to the applicant and the claim. We're very trained in listening very well, taking notes. Every asylum interview, there are detailed notes the asylum officer takes. And we have to obviously have an open mind. We cannot be in any way confrontational to the asylum applicant. We have to be completely unbiased. And before the pandemic, we normally did between 8 and 9 interviews per week. I know that one of the big concerns that everybody has now, and probably many people on the call, is the enormous wait list, the backlog within the asylum system. There's well over 425,000 cases in the backlog, well over 600,000 individuals that are still waiting either to get their first interview scheduled, or if they've had an interview already, to get a decision. It's an enormous backlog that has increased substantially over the last few years. And so there are individuals waiting 6, 7 years or even more to get a scheduled interview. And that's very unfortunate and does create a lot of stress, which I can speak about in a little bit. But since 2018, the process has been last in, first out. That means the applicants that are applying more recently for asylum will be scheduled before cases in the backlog. That makes it also, very stressful, obviously, for those in the backlog. The few things, the best practices to have for an interview. I just want to go over a few things, a few details. The best asylum applications contain a fully completed application, that all the questions and sections on the application are complete, that all the required documents are submitted, and I would say not an excessive amount of documents. In other words, sometimes if there's too many documents or too many, too much information that's given, that's not always the best thing. It's much preferable to have the asylum application typewritten rather than handwritten. It just makes it much easier for the asylum officer to review the file. And it's important also to note that the asylum officer normally gets the file of the case about 10 or 15 minutes before the actual interview. So there's not a lot of prep time that the asylum officers have to review the case. They're obviously experienced in this, but they don't have a lot of time in reviewing the case. And then a clear and concise summary of one's life in home country, past harm, and fear of future persecution should be clearly stated. That's some best examples for what an asylum application should contain. The best interviews should contain the clear and concise answers to all the questions posed by the asylum officer. That's very important, to listen carefully to the questions being posed by the asylum officer and give a clear and concise answer. To be properly dressed is important, not to be too casual. I would say a professional appearance would be preferable, to address professionally. Also maintain good eye contact with the asylum officer is important. And obviously, if there are some inconsistencies or discrepancies, you would be able to explain very clearly what those inconsistencies and discrepancies are, if there are any. Obviously, it's best if there are very few or no discrepancies or inconsistency. That makes the case much stronger. Never be confrontational or sarcastic, always be polite, and do not overly exaggerate or embellish the claim. In other words, tell straightforward information about what happened to you in your home country and what the fear is of going back without making it exaggerated. And the best, as an asylum officer, after doing I mentioned some 10,000 cases, the best cases are those that are believable, where the testimony makes sense. And so obviously to have a clear and concise testimony is important. Another question is about attorneys. I looked on the list of those that have RSVP'd or responded, and looked like maybe half have attorneys and half do not have attorneys. During the interview, the attorney basically accompanies the applicant, but doesn't have a lot of time to comment during the interview. The interviews normally last maybe 2 hours as a rule. And during those 2 hours, there's a lot of testimony and a lot of questions and answers. So the attorney basically is there to provide support to the applicant and also perhaps give a summary at the end. Some asylum officers don't want the attorneys to say anything at all, and that's kind of at the discretion of the particular asylum officer. And I would also caution to you that it's not required to have an attorney, but if you do have an attorney, I do think it's very advantageous in a lot of respects, because the attorney is well prepared to address any of the nuances or any of the complexities of the asylum laws, which are very complex. And so I want to just tell you that I do think it's quite important to have a good attorney. There are, unfortunately, some attorneys that are not good, or some attorneys or some individuals who claim to be attorneys, but may be, for example, notarios, which are people who may claim that they're a lawyer, but they're actually not, and they help prepare applications. And just be very careful that you're hiring somebody who is qualified. And also, since the asylum law is very complex, to have somebody who's very well versed in asylum, that has done previous asylum claims that have represented applicants in the past. I think that's also quite important. So I would suggest that people look at this attorney-client issue very carefully, and I can speak to that in a bit if you have any specific questions. Without an attorney, looks like half of the individuals on this webinar claim that they don't have an attorney. And if you do go in to the asylum without an attorney, which I did have many, I would say of all the applicants that I interviewed, I would say well over half did not have attorneys. But and if you don't have an attorney, just try to be obviously as well prepared as possible, and to be as truthful and convincing as possible, because the asylum officer has to make a decision normally within a 2-week period. The decision also has to be reviewed, particularly nowadays. Any positive asylum decision has to be reviewed by a supervisor. So it's important, if you don't have an attorney, to be well prepared. And the filing deadline is an issue with, I know some of you, there are some exceptions to filing asylum if you're beyond the 1-year period. And these are extraordinary or changed circumstances. And they could include, for example, changed country conditions in your country of origin, or perhaps never falling out of legal status. If you're here, for example, as a student on a student visa, and if you continued and show proof that you're a student, that would be an exception as well to the 1-year filing deadline. After I decided, after more than 20 years, to retire, what I'm doing now is conducting mock interviews prior to their actual asylum interview for asylum candidates. And I thought that would be the best way to utilize my vast experience, is to fully prepare the applicant for the asylum interview. So I would go from basically the entire interview. You would have an excellent idea what it would be like during the actual interview at the asylum office. So that's the service that I'm providing now to asylum applicants. Nowadays, the number of cases are beginning to increase a little bit, the number of scheduled cases. They're still not to pre-pandemic levels. Some offices are increasing their capacity. I know that the USCIS is hiring well over 100 new asylum officers because the need is so great. Hopefully, with the uptick of scheduled interviews, many of you will be receiving your interviews soon. I can't say when, but hopefully soon. That being the case, I think I outlined some basic points. I guess if anybody has any specific questions at this point, I'd be happy to entertain.